Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here, coming at you with another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. This one is episode 65, and the video version shall be found at libertyweekly.net/65, where it will be embedded in the show notes page there. I'm joined again by good friend Kyle Anzalone, who is the resident foreign policy expert at the Libertarian Union, and his appearances are becoming somewhat of a staple on this show. And that's a development that I appreciate very much. But how are you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing well, and I appreciate it very much too. I absolutely love coming on your show, Pat. You always ask great questions, and for those of you who aren't subscribing to Pat's show on Patreon and donating some money for him to approve it because it's a great show, you should, because we just had a great conversation prior to this, and it's worth listening to.
Yeah, definitely. And so whenever I talk to guests, usually if there's a bit that we do beforehand, because Kyle and I have been talking for about 30 minutes now, but if there's a bit that we talk beforehand, I'll throw up the extras on for the Patreons. And I also, funny you mention it, Kyle, because I just dropped a complete bonus episode today that was like 50 minutes long. And I was just talking about the books I like to read and stuff. Just so the listeners can kind of get a more intimate connection here. But so Kyle, why don't you do all your plugs quick before we get into today? We'll be talking about Syria and doing a Syria update. Trump was saying that we need to get out of Syria, and then he changed his mind. So before we get into that, Kyle, you want to plug your content?
Yeah, so I'm the host of Foreign Policy Focus. It's a podcast, do it 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, usually like 20 minutes to a half hour for an episode talking about the news and foreign policy. Sometimes I do deeper dives. Frequent guest is Will Porter, who I also write articles with. Our most recent article was published at Consortium News. All my work can be found at libertarianinstitute.org. And then I also run Immersion News, which is my brand new news website. It's really cool. It's got some more interactive features to come, but it's already got a lot of stuff on it. A massive archive. I got like 1,500 articles up there already. So I think you guys will enjoy it.
Yeah, that is awesome. And we'll show it. I'm sure it'll be featured your website, Immersion News, here as we start talking about the stories and the news. But I wanted to, I need to get Will Porter on the show because I want to do like a series of, what is the Taliban and what is Al-Qaeda and what is ISIS and stuff. So you should get on me to link up with Will Porter for
Absolutely.
sure.
Will is great on the history of ISIS. In fact, he came on my show and we did a 2-part series. It's probably like an hour and a half worth of content on the rise and fall of ISIS, all the way from like 2006 with the formation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually split off into ISIS and al-Nusra, and to their defeat, which is more or less happening right now.
Yeah. And I'm glad because I'm starting to learn this stuff, and we were talking before we went on too about how I'm finally learning about foreign policy, and you can see through the episodes how my understanding is increasing. I'm not there yet, but we're really getting there. So let's just dive into it, Kyle. So what is the deal with Trump? What did he gave a campaign style speech talking about how we need to get out of Syria?
Yeah, well, I guess he was giving a campaign-style speech, or at least that's the way it's been billed in Ohio. And there he said, we're going to be leaving Syria really soon, and just kind of talked about, his want to get out of Syria. Immediately, it's kind of reported that, this is just Trump speaking off the cuff and saying, Trumpian things like he does occasionally. However, that actually wasn't the case. And this was a point he had been raising for at least a couple weeks at the White House. And so it showed that there was real interest from Trump in doing this. Everybody talks about how short his attention span was. Well, this kept his attention for quite some time. Now, after making that announcement in the subsequent tweet that more or less, confirmed and backed up that position that Trump was hoping to leave Syria, his advisors got to him. I know General Votel, who is CENTCOM commander, and Brett McGurk, who is I believe, civilian envoy to Syria, really came out and said, like, absolutely, this is a terrible idea. And eventually we have the White House saying that there's no timeline on U.S. withdrawal in Syria. I saw CNN floated a story that said 6 months, but let's face it, withdrawing from 6 months from now might as well mean 6 years. Who really knows?
Yeah, for as long as we've been involved in with no clear objective, I guess, other than getting rid of ISIS. And it would follow logically that since ISIS is almost gone or their influence is waning, definitely, wouldn't it follow logically that our time there should be over?
Well, I guess we could go back to the start of this in that there really wasn't a need for America to defeat ISIS. Even at the maximum size of the Islamic Caliphate, they were surrounded by enemies on all sides. The Syrian Kurds were fighting against them. The Iraqi Kurds were fighting against them. The Iraqi government, the Iranian government, the Lebanese government. The Turkish government was a little bit more sympathetic than others. The Syrian government, and then the Russians got involved. And so there were plenty of people to fight against ISIS. Now, did ISIS get defeated quicker, especially in Syrian Kurdistan and in Iraq because of the U.S. intervention and air support? I'm sure that did happen. We dropped a massive number of bombs, hundreds of bombs a month. I mean, Patrick Coburn estimates that in the, quote unquote, liberation of Mosul, 40,000 civilians were killed. Now, not all those were by the United States in our bombs, but a large amount of them were, probably the majority. And so just the idea that, the United States needed to be involved to defeat ISIS, it really doesn't hold water. But that fact, remains, is that ISIS is nearing defeat. They hold some territory in both Iraq and Syria. Most of it's in very sparsely populated areas, though.
Well, that's good that you brought that up too, to talk about, how we weren't needed there to defeat ISIS. And well, then what is the other justification for us being in Syria? And I'll throw you a big bone. John Bolton talking about this mythical land bridge between Tehran and Beirut. You want to talk about that and debunk that?
Yeah, so I get this has to be the unofficial reason for being in Syria, because I think if people, knew that we were suddenly fighting in Syria against Iran or in prevention of an Iranian land bridge, then Congress may have to do some authorizing. And not that I don't know, maybe it would even pass, which is a scary thing. But the fact is that there definitely needs to be some congressional authorization if that's what the United States is planning on doing here. But can we pull up a map real quick, Pat? And this will probably make more sense with the map.
Yeah, definitely go for it.
All right. So I'm going to share the screen here, and we are going to look at a map of the Middle East. I'll zoom out a little bit from Syria just so you can see what's going on here. So here's Iran, Iraq, Syria, and then right kind of on the western edge of Syria here, you have Lebanon. And so in Lebanon and in southern Lebanon, with the border of Israel, the military force there is a group called Hezbollah. And now originally this was kind of like an insurgency that fought against the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, but is now more or less, just a part of the Lebanese military. And I think a very strong portion of the Lebanese military. And so Israel and American propaganda bills Hezbollah as an existential threat to Israel. They now like to talk about the 150,000 missiles that Hezbollah constantly has pointed at Israel. And they claim that, if you see here, if Iran is able to, help Assad liberate all of Syria, then they would be able to drive all the missiles and equipment they want to Beirut and to Hezbollah there in southern Lebanon. Of course, the problem is that, as Scott Horton likes to say, haven't these people ever heard of planes? And that, the land bridge wasn't and isn't the only way for Iran to get weapons to Syria. Also, a lot of this area, especially along the Iraq-Syria border, is pretty sparsely populated. So I'm sure if there wasn't a way to fly planes, smuggling is an option. But if you guys look here, the amount of border between Syria and Iraq is very long and very large. And this is the area, the yellow on the map, for those of you who can't see the map, east of the Euphrates River in Syria is the area controlled by the United States and our proxy force, the Syrian-Kurdish YPG. And you can see here that there's already border shared between the Iraqi state and the Syrian government. And so if the idea is that the land bridge is already there. That's my point. The land bridge already exists.
Yeah, and so these, and maybe this is kind of digressing from it, but we were talking about Hezbollah. Before we went on, we were talking about the Reagan episode where we intervened in Lebanon. I'm sure that this goes back further than that, But how long, I mean, how long have we been involved with this conflict?
Well, I mean, it's kind of complicated because we've been all on all different sides of this conflict. I mean, prior to 56, we supported or prior to 79, excuse me, we supported Iran. And then after 79, Iran became our enemies. Prior to that, we were enemies of Saddam Hussein. And we, favored Iran versus Saddam Hussein. And then after the Iranian Revolution, it changes and suddenly Saddam Hussein is at least tolerable compared to the Iranians. In fact, we gave Saddam Hussein some weapons that he later used against both the Kurds and the Iraqi Shiites. But the important part of the land bridge story, too, is that Iraq was enemies of Iran long-standing, and it wasn't until the United States killed Saddam Hussein and then fought a war for the Shiites in Iraq to take control of the capital city and a lot of Iraq from the Sunnis, and then demanded democracy, one man, one vote in Syria or in Iraq. It created a situation where suddenly the Iraqi government is now allies and friendly with Iran. And so if our big fear is empowering Iran in the Middle East, the biggest move to empower Iran in the Middle East wasn't anything that Iran has done. It's exactly what George Bush, John Bolton, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld did by lying America into the second Iraq war.
Okay, and that's important too, because that kind of plays into the Kurds and their plight. So one thing that we were talking about again before we went on was talking about how after you have Desert Storm happen and then George H.W. Bush encourages the people of Iraq to come up and overthrow Saddam Hussein and pledges that we will help them out. And then he hangs them out to dry. And so if you would, can you talk about how that unfolded? And this is unclear to me because I haven't finished the book yet, but so was it that George H.W. Bush promised support to the Iraqi Kurds? Then he pulled the rug out from under them, and Saddam Hussein went on a tear, persecuting them, and then they were displaced, and they traveled to what we know now as Kurdistan, in between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq.
Yeah, so I mean, air power is pretty important, but this is especially so in areas that aren't like forested and stuff like that, like Iraq. And so the United States, kind of told and enabled both Kurdish rebellion in Iraq, and that's northern Iraq. Here's Kurdish area, and then in southern Iraq is Shia area, and they encouraged both of those groups to rebel against the Saddam government. And Saddam was a Sunni Ba'athist, and the Sunni Ba'athists, I guess at least at that time, had control over the Sunni tribal lands and was, I guess, somewhat peaceful and agreeable with the Sunni tribes at that time. And so really what this was is the United States planning the overthrow of Saddam Hussein back in the early 1990s. And during this time, there was a lot of talk about if the United States was going to go to Baghdad. We had chased the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, and now we are looking at going all the way to Baghdad, and they decided against it. When they decided against it, they also withdrew what would have been, I guess, the United States like no-fly zone over the different kind of Kurdish and Shia areas, and removed U.S. support from those areas, and left a large portion of Saddam's air force and his army intact. And so these groups rose up expecting United States power backing behind them, and they didn't get any of it, and Saddam slaughtered them. I guess it's also, worth just giving a little bit of analysis from an Austrian economics perspective, right? Basically, what we did is we created a bubble. Imagine if the Fed went out tomorrow and said that we're going to print $10 trillion and give it to these three banks. What would happen, to the stock shares of those three banks? They would, go up, and there would be a whole bunch of implications in the economy. And then if they said, never mind, we changed our mind, we're not doing that, then there would be a lot of real loss and a lot of real pain as the market had to correct itself. And in this case, we're talking about, the United States inflating the power and the capabilities of the Iraqi Kurds and Shia, and then, saying, oh, never mind, we changed our mind, and then the real pain when the correction came, and that was Saddam Hussein coming in and slaughtering people.
Okay, and would you say, would it be fair to say that there is some guilt in the U.S. administration for having done that, and is that why we're involved in supporting the Kurds in Syria?
None.
Okay.
I think that, all right, so my guess would be that the reason...
Sorry, they don't get guilty. I mean, yeah,
right.
Go for it.
Yeah, so anyways, I would say that the reason the United States is supporting the Kurds in Syria, now scroll my map over, as I said, the Syrian Kurds now militarily control most of eastern Syria, east of the Euphrates River, but the Syrian Kurdish land is a little bit more in northeastern Syria. The Deir ez-Zor province and Raqqa and all this land down here is really a little bit more Arab land than ethnically Kurds. But anyways, the reason I think the United States is backing the Syrian Kurds is just because they were really our only viable ally. We tried to back the Sunni resistance and the Sunni rebellion to Assad, but it turns out that that was ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so you can't support them anymore. You can't support Assad. That really only leaves the Syrian Kurds.
Okay, and so I'm gonna move us on a little bit here. So what happens is that let me show this AP press article that was talking. It kind of recounted. I'll go into screen share here, but it kind of recounted Trump going in private talking about the pullout. I've gone through this, but there was one paragraph that I want to zoom in here. It says, the United States is working every day on the ground and with the international community to help stabilize those areas liberated from ISIS and identify ways to move forward with reconstruction once there has been a peaceful political transition away from Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, according to a statement from the department. So my big question to that narrative is, how are they going to get rid of Assad? And it seems to me like through all of this, all he has done is gain power, and both politically and militarily. How do they envision this actually happening?
I mean, I really don't see a way the United States could get rid of Assad at this point. I mean, there was a time when Assad was losing the Syrian civil war. However, you know, Russia came to Assad's aid and prevented either al-Nusra or al-Qaeda from assuming the throne in Damascus. So I don't know how you could say that was a negative thing, but the United States does. So the idea that the United States isn't going to provide any aid to Syria until Assad must go is just, it's a sham. It's a lie, right? The United States wants to pretend like we're going to help rebuild Syria after we spend all that time bombing and killing people in Syria, but we had to wait until that mean, nasty Bashar al-Assad goes. The fact is that Assad isn't going to go. I could flip back to the map here real quick just to, you know, show how clear this is. If you look at the area controlled by Bashar al-Assad, it is a big portion of the Syrian state. I think it's close to 50% at this point, and it's most of the population centers, including the entire capital city now. He controls Palmyra, he controls most of Homs and Hama. He's moving towards Dara in the south, a large portion of the Syrian desert, and so I have no idea how Assad goes. It's obvious that there is no Kurdish force, even with American backing, that could take out Assad. The Syrian rebels are all jihadists, so there's nobody for the United States to fight against Assad. And honestly, I don't think the Syrian Kurds want to fight against Assad. If you look at how things have unfolded during the Syrian civil war, I think there have been some skirmishes between the two, and at one time there was pro-Assad forces moving towards YPG territory, and the United States bombed them. But at the same time, there's been a relative agreement here that Assad wasn't going to attack the Kurds and the Kurds weren't going to attack Assad, and that's more or less held. So, the United States has no way to get rid of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, other than, I mean, the United States could drop a bomb on Damascus and hope to kill him in his presidential palace. I don't want to say that, you know, it's impossible for the United States to do it. There's just like no practical way for it to be done. I guess I just want to clarify that in case tomorrow Trump decides to nuke Damascus.
Yeah, right. Well, okay. So I brought up this article here because I saw it in doing my prep for this interview. But so then what are they doing besides just, you know, autistically screeching about chemical weapons? You know, we still have them talking about that attack that happened a year ago that you and Will Porter have talked about. I don't want to say ad nauseum, but you've addressed a lot quite thoroughly and debunked, you know, the narrative that this was Russian. But what do they hope to achieve? I mean, military intervention, but wouldn't any military intervention result in war between the United States and Russia?
Well, right. I guess that's the other thing. They've tried to take like the Assad's like this super evil guy, and we're going to get rid of him through the international court. Not going to happen. First of all, at this point, Assad, I think, probably understands that the only way he would ever lose power in Syria, or at least power over most of Syria, is if he carried out some kind of big chemical weapons attack, and it was actually him who did it. And they were able to prove that was the case. But even then, I think Russia would make a pretty heavy effort into making sure that Assad didn't take too much of the fall for that, as he is, the person on the throne in Syria, and the closest one to regaining control and stability in the country. I mean, if you look at the areas that are under Assad control as compared to the ones under rebel control, the areas under Assad control do much better after the rebels are gone.
Yeah, but that's not to say that Assad is a great person either, and I'm sure that you agree with this, but I was just reading a bunch of articles from antiwar.com, and the link is eluding me right now, but just that, these Russian airstrikes and the Russian attempts and the Assad's attempts to get rid of the rebels in Damascus have too resulted in huge humanitarian problems that, blowing up houses or apartment complex full of people. Can you say a little bit towards that?
Yeah, well, I mean, just because Assad isn't using chemical weapons doesn't mean that Assad isn't killing civilians and isn't doing terrible things in Syria. I'm sure there's been extrajudicial killings going on in Syria. I'm sure that some people have been at least treated in ways that we would consider torture. I'm sure there's been people that, even by Syrian standards, have been tortured to death under Assad. That being said, those things have happened under United States rule and control too. So, you know what I mean? This is like the nature of the world when you're fighting insurgencies. A lot of the problems you have to point back to the fact that the United States gave weapons to the terrorists in the first place. I mean, if al-Nusra and ISIS weren't running around Syria with Tate missiles, which are these great missiles that are able to destroy armored vehicles and helicopters very accurately. Well, where they come from? The United States sold them to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia gave them to rebel groups who either had them taken from them, who were actually ISIS all along, or who later became ISIS or al-Nusra, or sold them to ISIS or al-Nusra. Either way, our weapons ended up in the hands of the bad guys. And this created a situation where ISIS and al-Nusra controlled far more territory in Syria than they ever would have been able to just from their popular support in Syria. Yeah, I'm sure that there's some Sunni areas of Syria that even when Assad was in power would have kind of fought back and revolted against Assad with or without U.S. power. But a lot of them were able to expand so far and take so much territory, specifically ISIS, because of all the U.S. help. And so now Assad's faced with the problem that he has an area of his capital city held by jihadists who are shelling and bombing civilian targets in Damascus. And he has to do something about that because, that's what the leader and the president of a country does. And especially when they're a dictator who wants to maintain their power and control. And so I saw somebody tweet on Twitter once, something along the lines of, before you judge, what is going on in Syria too harshly, just think about what the United States would do if, let's say, Birmingham was held by ISIS, right? Do you think the Mises Institute would be standing at the end of that? I don't think so.
Yeah, right. Well, mentioning the Mises Institute, then what is the proper lens with which to view this as a libertarian? Because I think once you start learning about it, you learn that it's infinitely complicated. But at the same time, there's a small part of you, at least for me, and maybe this is a very, very ignorant statement, but at least for me, there's a small part of me that wants to cheer for the Pashtun tribes in southern Afghanistan because from their perspective, you know, they're rightfully in their homeland fighting against a foreign invader. And I don't want to say cheer, you know, maybe I'd walk back from that statement, but you would certainly view them more sympathetically. So as a libertarian, would it be correct to say, you know, we have the non-aggression principle, so that's how we would analyze these conflicts, but sometimes it's more complicated. Well, how do you view it, Kyle?
Well, I guess my libertarian solution would be that the United States needs to make plans to immediately withdraw from, just start with the Middle Eastern conflicts. I know we have troops in 130 countries around the world and all this stuff, but where we're really doing most of the bombing and damage is in the Middle East. Now, if the only way we could do it is by bringing every single troop home tomorrow, then let's do it that way. But I mean, I'm sure there's a more orderly way to leave to make sure we're not leaving, you know, caches of weapons sitting around the Middle East available for any old jihadist, you know, driving down the road to pick up and throw in the bed of his truck. That, you know what I mean? And so just how incompetent the American, government has seemed to be, especially the massive bureaucracy in the Department of Defense. I would like them to have a small amount of time to, you know, try to figure out how to do this. Also, you have the problem that if you look at the map in Syria, the Syrian Kurds have way over expanded outside of Syrian Kurdish territory, and they control a lot of Arab lands. And so this means is that if they lose United States support tomorrow, they're probably going to lose a lot of territory and a lot of people are going to die. And so if the United States could let these people know what's going to happen and allow them to make some preparations before we immediately pull the rug out from under them, kind of like what happened, you know, in Iraq during the first Iraq war, that would be helpful. You know, maybe some of these people, you have to give them visas to other countries or whatever, to get them out of there, to make sure they, you know, could be able to live, continuing forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. No, it does. And yeah, it's just so difficult. And you feel like we were talking again before the show how, you just try and view it the best way that you can. And I can tell you one thing for certain is that our presence there isn't making things better.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to undersell like that. The defeat of ISIS was a good thing. I mean, the ISIS people were absolutely sick and cruel people, and they enforced like the worst, most stringent form of Islamic law, including killing people for smoking cigarettes. I mean, I've heard some really terrible horror stories that I'm not going to repeat here about what ISIS has done to people to kill them. But just looking at what they've done on videotape. In the videos that I'm sure most of everybody have seen online of the beheadings and stuff like that. Yeah, it's good that ISIS is gone. A lot of these people needed to die because they were terrible, terrible human beings. The general point is that these problems could be worked out locally.
Yeah, yes, definitely. And so a little roadmap for the rest of the episode here. I think we're approaching the halfway mark. Why don't we touch a little bit on the situation in Damascus since we last talked? I think that was about 2 weeks ago. And just, you want to give us an update on the situation there, and then we can go to the Afrin problem and with Turkey and stuff.
Yeah, right. I wish I remembered exactly where I left off, but basically, for the most part, Damascus is getting pretty close to being liberated from Syrian rebel groups overall. There was an agreement between all the Syrian rebel groups in eastern Ghouta and the Syrian government. However, there continues to be one group that's a little bit more of a moderate group than the rest of the Syrian jihadists, and in fact fought against them. And I think I mentioned this on the last show, and that presents part of the problem is that these rebels may not be welcome in the Idlib province, and so it may be sending them to their slaughter to go up there, and for that reason they're not surrendering. However, most of the rebel groups and most of the jihadist groups in eastern Ghouta have surrendered. As you see here, there is an area that is controlled by ISIS and some jihadist groups south of Damascus. This is actually a Palestinian refugee camp and then surrounding area that is held by the rebel groups there. I think those groups are a little bit more isolated and don't seem to be carrying out quite as many attacks against the civilian population of Syria as did the jihadist rebel groups in eastern Ghouta. It seems like Assad and Russia are pushing the rebels in Druma, which is the last neighborhood in eastern Ghouta controlled by Syrian rebels, to surrender and to give up. However, thus far they've been unwilling to do so, and hopefully Assad doesn't end up going through with a bombing campaign to get them out, and they end up surrendering or coming to some kind of reconciliation deal. That way, you destroy you prevent the destruction of this neighborhood. But I don't know what's going to happen there, to be honest, man. It doesn't look good, I guess, would be the situation. I believe I saw yesterday that Assad and Russia had dropped some airstrikes on Druma, and it looks like that they're going to start again with the military campaign and move away from the diplomacy.
Yeah, and that's what I was referring to when I was talking about the Assad and the Russians bombing apartment buildings and stuff and killing a bunch of civilians. That was a story that I saw on antiwar.com. But so that rebel group that can't go to the Idlib province, are they in Duma?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if they can't go there. That's been part of the talk about why this particular rebel group hasn't given up. Like I said, I do think that these particular rebels seem to be maybe not moderate rebels by our standards, but not quite as jihadist as the average al-Nusra jihadist. If you kind of get what I'm saying there. And so maybe one day they'll figure out a way to either go to Idlib or to join Turkey in the Euphrates Shield. As you saw on the map, and I'll zoom back out, the United States does control some area down here near Al-Tamp in the Syrian desert. And I believe there's still about 1,000 Syrian rebel fighters loyal to the United States in that area. And so, maybe there is somewhere for these people to go, but thus far they haven't.
Okay. And so I think maybe this is a good transition point into what's happening in Manbij. So why don't we give like a little primer of what Operation Olive Branch, I know that we've talked about it before, but do you just want to introduce us that way?
All right. So Operation Olive Branch started in the beginning of 2018. And what Turkey initially said is that they were going to take all the border areas of the Afghan enclave that was controlled by the Syrian Kurds. What they ended up doing was taking pretty much the whole enclave down to the edge of the Aleppo province, where the Syrian Kurds still hold some territory. It looked like, and there was a lot of fear that in the actual city of Afrin, which was about 200,000 Kurds living there in a population center, that there was going to be a siege of that city similar to what we saw in eastern Aleppo, East Mosul, Raqqa, eastern Ghouta, where a lot of civilians ended up dying. However, the Syrian Kurds ended up deciding to withdraw. And so I guess in a way this does give some credit to the Syrian Kurds not being quite as terrible as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and using civilians as human shields and hoping to draw international outcry to their aid, by showing that Turkey was killing a bunch of Kurdish civilians. But they decided to withdraw, and now the battlefront looks like it's moving east to the city of Manbij. Now, the reason this is like the biggest Kurdish-held city on the west side of the Euphrates River. Turkey, since pretty much the beginning of the Syrian civil war, but definitely since the United States giving support to the Syrian Kurds, have said that their deal is that the Syrian Kurds have to stay on the east side of the Euphrates River, and if they cross onto the west side, Turkey's going to attack them. Now, for a long time, this was just threats by Turkey, but eventually they started Operation Olive Branch and actually started attacking them. Now, the city of Manbij differs a little bit from Afrin. As you can see, there's not the big yellow area connected up here is called Rojava for the Syrian Kurds. That's what they call it, and that's the area backed by the United States. In this area of Afrin, they were actually embedded with Russian troops until the Russians decided to withdraw. And I believe this was after the Syrian Kurds rebuffed some reconciliation offers from the Syrian government and from the Russians to unite with the Syrian government there. So after the Russian troops withdrew, that's when the Turks went in. Like I said, over in Manbij, it's a different story because that's where the U.S. troops are backing the Syrian Kurds.
And so as we've covered before, obviously Turkey is a NATO ally, and that presents a big problem because now you have, yeah, I mean, I would describe this as kind of a standoff now between the United States supporting the YPG and the invading Turkish forces. Is that an accurate description, that term standoff?
Yeah, I think the only part that's a little inaccurate is that it's a new thing. This has been going on since I think about 2016 is when Manbij was liberated from ISIS. And pretty much immediately, what the United States had to start doing is putting big American flags on the back of Humvees and driving them around the lines between the Turkish-backed Syrian rebels, also sometimes known as the Euphrates Shield forces, and the Syrian-Kurdish lines. And so, these troops would drive around because the idea is that nobody on either side will shoot at the Americans because we're allies with both. And so for a long time, the United States was doing that. Now, then for a while, the United States said, oh, we're not doing what they call presence patrols anymore. That's basically where we show America's presence to make sure that nobody attacks a certain area. However, the Defense Department's propaganda site, DVID, accidentally posted some pictures of U.S. soldiers driving around Manbij and called them presence patrols. And so we know that the U.S. soldiers are actually still doing that there.
Okay, and do you know anything about France's involvement in this whole issue too? And I'll do the screen share here. So apologies if you don't. But this is coming up here. But I had this article that I was reading in preparation too. France must choose an ally, either the YPG or Turkey. And this is so complicated, Kyle.
Well, right. And so I think France has had a pretty long-standing issue with Turkey, at least dating back to the coup in Turkey in 2016. Turkey has kind of flirted with the idea of joining the EU. It seems like Erdogan is less interested, the current leader of Turkey, than joining the EU than past leaders of Turkey. But the point remains is that of NATO allies, France, I don't think, is a huge fan of Turkey, and those feelings seem to be somewhat mutual. Now, I wasn't aware that France was super heavily involved in the U.S. coalition fighting against ISIS. In fact, it seemed like our main enemy, our allies there would be the UK, Australia, and then more of our Arab allies that we were using to help. But I guess there was French special forces in the area, and they sent those forces to Manbij.
Yeah, and
I found the move interesting. I'm not quite sure what Macron's president of France, Macron's play is here. It seems almost silly and needless. I don't know why Turkey or Erdogan would be any less likely to attack Manbij since there's French there, because Americans are already there. Maybe it's pressure from the United States that it gives it an international presence, and so it looks better in the United States us keeping our troops there if it's not just American troops but U.S. coalition troops, and we could include French and Brits and everybody else. I mean, remember, a U.S. soldier died in Syria outside of Manbij last week, but also a Brit died there too. And so we know British soldiers are there as well. And so maybe they're just trying to up the international presence in Syria and in Manbij, and hoping that this will make it a little bit more palatable to American citizens. But like I said, I don't know why this would deter Erdogan more than anything else.
Well, yeah, and I was going to say that from what I've read in the past few weeks, it seems that Turkey doesn't really care who's in Manbij. It seems like they're going to take it. Maybe that's just rhetoric, but it seems like they really don't care.
Well, I mean, I like to think that too, but at the same time, the United States has 50 nuclear weapons in Turkey. So I think Turkey does care. And I think that's why Turkey hasn't attacked Manbij yet. Uh, the reason, I guess, this is an important thing to say. The reason that Turkey wants to attack Manbij and has so many demands of the Syrian Kurds and the YPG is that Turkey has a very large Kurdish minority population in their country. And they have, treated those Kurds pretty poorly, and the Syrian Kurds have formed a militia, the PKK, and what, I don't want to like present this as me taking a side on the issue because I really don't know, but it does seem like this is kind of the classic Middle Eastern insurgency where the minority groups are using insurgent tactics like different bombings and stuff like that, and the PKK are recognized as an international terrorist group, for whatever that title means. Turkey says that the Syrian Kurds and the YPG are just the Syrian branch of the PKK, no different. It's just like how the United States says that we could go bomb ISIS-K in Afghanistan because they're just the Islamic State affiliate of the Afghan affiliate of the Islamic State. And so that's the reason that Turkey is so dead set against attacking Syria here, or at least that's their public position. You could argue or talk about that Erdogan has other ideas like wanting a larger seat at the Syrian negotiating table or something like that.
Yeah, it's a convenient argument that they make. Just referring to the Turkey making the same argument that we make for our interventions, that it's the same branch, just a different head of the Hydra, if you will. I wanted to get to this article too, because all of this is brewing now, and it was Trump's statement saying, well, we're going to pull out of Syria. It was the Pentagon and his advisors that seemed to really convince him that that was a bad idea to pull out of Syria. And now we see, quite the opposite sign is that U.S. forces in Syria, as you see the article up here, U.S. forces in Syria are seen setting up new frontline positions. Does this show us anything, Kyle? Anything new?
Well, I was very surprised by it. I guess we could start there. I guess it surprised me that, the United States was expanding in Syria, especially because this is such a contentious point with our Turkish allies. And like I said, we have nuclear weapons in that country. And so, there's a reason that the United States wants to have good relations with Turkey and, and with our NATO allies, right? So this is, I'm sure, going to really tick off the Turks because the United States keeps promising them things about the United States role with helping and assisting the Syrian Kurds, like saying, oh, we're going to stop giving them weapons. Once they stop fighting ISIS, we'll take the weapons away. Yeah, we promise that they're not going to go on the west side of the Euphrates River. They're not going to form a lasting militia. And the Syrian Kurds in the YPG keep doing all these things with the United States support. And so I'm sure just from Turkey's perspective, they're going to look at this as a little bit of a slap in the face and saying that, oh, it's kind of obvious that the United States isn't going along with their plan because the United States said pretty recently to Turkey that we are going to move the Syrian Kurds out of Manbij and to the east side of the Euphrates River. So it seems like that's not the case. One of the interesting things about the story that's worth pointing out is that, at least the way it's reported, is that the United States was just driving around with some Associated Press reporters in Syria showing them what's going on. And they drove past the spot where there are some American troops. And I think you can see some of these pictures here. And the reporter said, oh, what's going on there? And they said, oh, we're setting up some new outposts. And so I was only aware of one of them, but I'm sure if they're setting up two, that seems true enough to me as well. I don't know, why it would only be one or whatever. But anyways, I don't know. I found that to be somewhat interesting. That's not like this came in a press release or anything. I'm sure it was planned. I would hope at least that the U.S. Army isn't driving around journalists and actually having the journalists stumble upon our secrets of what we're doing over there.
Yeah. And I first heard about this when Daniel McAdams and Ron Paul were talking about it on the Liberty Report. I think that was Wednesday, maybe. So maybe
I'm pretty sure it was yesterday's show.
Yesterday? Okay, yeah, it was Thursday. So, well, So I think we've covered this enough. Moving, I just wanted to touch on how the Afrin province is faring after being conquered, if you will, by Turkey. And I brought up this. Can you shed some light on this for us, Kyle?
I mean, I haven't read anything. I was saying the past 2 weeks on, this was probably March 25th, seems about the last time I would have read something on the conditions in Afrin. But at least what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of looting going on by either Turkish soldiers, or Turkey says, oh, these are the Syrian rebel groups that were fighting alongside us. We told them not to do it, but they looted anyways. It seems like, they're trying to, if not force out the Kurds that are there, definitely trying to resettle Sunni Syrians in that area to change kind of the balance of population, the demographics.
Okay, yeah. I just I couldn't remember if we had talked about this the last time that you were on, because I think the Kurds had Turkey had conquered the Afrin province last time we spoke, so I wasn't sure if we had covered it or not.
I think, as I mentioned before, they had surrounded the city of Afrin. It looked like there was going to be a siege, but at the last minute or so, the YPG and a lot of the Syrian-Kurdish left the city to Turkey to take. And so the actual takeover of Afrin was one of the smoothest transitions. I guess I shouldn't laugh, but it's a little bit interesting of power shifts in the Syrian civil war. This is one of the few times where the enemy didn't embed and use the civilians as human shields, and the YPG decided that they weren't going to let that Kurdish city be turned to rubble and thousands of Kurdish civilians be killed, and then they decided to all leave.
Okay, yeah, sorry, we did cover that. I just it flew past me a little bit. No, that's great. So yeah, I think that just about covers it for this episode today. Just going over Syria. Like I said before, I'd love to make this it has kind of turned into a more regular thing that we're doing here, and I appreciate that greatly. So do you want to give another plug for your websites, and definitely that article you co-wrote with Will Porter?
All right. Foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com is the website for the show. Libertarianinstitute.org. You can find my show and my daily news roundups. All my news is posted on my really cool new news website, immersionnews.com. Check that out, everyone. Thanks to the urging of your host, truly, Pat. I am now on BitChute and MeWe. I love MeWe. Everybody should check out that one. BitChute, I don't do as much video, so I don't think I get as much traction on as Pat does, but it's definitely a cool outlet, especially with some of the stuff that's going on with YouTube and demonetizing videos. And as I talked about in the last Libertarian Union, if you all didn't check it out, they're deleting videos of violence going on in the Middle East. Unfortunately, this violence and these videos on YouTube are the only evidence that exists that war crimes are going on. And so down with YouTube, up with BitChute, and that article I wrote with Will. It was on the Afghan opium trade, ran on Consortium News, and maybe we could throw a link up to it on the show notes page, Pat.
Yeah, most definitely. And let me show off your website right here, Immersion News. Part of the reason why I keep asking you on is because there's a few reasons. A, it's like having my own personal tutor as I read and learn about all this stuff. So it's like having the expert, and you can ask him all the questions you want. It's awesome. And B is because I know it's when we get on, it's easier for you to have the map and stuff like that. So that way, you don't have to waste your time trying to create video content, and we can just do it this way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'll just come on Pat's show.
Yeah, exactly. It is a lot more time, actually. And I know you have a full-time job and everything too. So yeah, great. Excellent. So glad to have you on again, Kyle. Really appreciate it. And until next time, it'll probably be a couple weeks or something.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on again, Pat.